Okay, so I want to talk about the naturalistic fallacy today, which is a criticism of naturalism. So, this is a criticism of naturalism by G.E. Moore, who was a philosopher in the early 20th century and wrote a book called Principia Ethica. Um, so, the key idea for him is that a naturalist theory makes a mistake. They are wrong. Naturalist theories are wrong. Why? Because you can't define good. Now, this is not an argument for anti-realism. Moore was a realist of his own kind. He was an intuitionist, but it's instead an argument against naturalism. Now, remember, naturalism says that good is some form of natural property in the world. Think of Mill here as a good example of that, who thinks that good, being utilitarian, is pleasure, is happiness. They're the same thing. And Moore thinks, one second, you can't define good. Now, to understand why you can't define good, we need to go down the rabbit hole a little bit, and we need to talk about definitions and open and closed questions. So let's start with open and closed questions. An open question is where the definition doesn't work. No definition. It is not successful. Because the questions are still open. You can still ask questions about it. So let me give you an example down here to see what we mean. So we can understand the terms and still ask questions. Here's an example. The sky is blue. Well, that's not great, right, as a definition, because, of course, I can still ask questions. I can say, for instance, well, is the sky always blue? I can imagine some sort of sky that's kind of slightly darker. Maybe it's got very grey clouds going on. That there is a sun there somewhere, but there are clouds all over it, and it's dark and miserable and full of horror for the storm to come. We can ask reasonably, kind of, is it always? Now, we've understood the concept of blue, and we've understood the concept of sky, but there's still an open question. In other words, it is not a definition, because you can still ask questions. The questions are still open. Whereas a successful definition closes all questions. It leaves us with closed questions. It is a good definition. Because if you understand the terms, there are no questions left. An example of this would be water, drawn expertly here, I'm sure you'll agree, is H2O. Okay, the chemical formulation. There isn't a reasonable question. I can't, for instance, ask, is water always H2O? That doesn't make any sense, does it? If you're giving me something that isn't H2O, okay, well, that's not water. That makes no sense whatsoever. It is closed to questions. We have defined it into its constituent parts. Its parts are defined. And that brings us on to what Moore thinks of as kind of what I can only call the definition of definitions. He thinks a definition only works if it's a definition of a complex object, right? So he says definitions are only possible, so definitions are only possible when the object or notion, so idea, is something complex, is something that needs to be broken down into its parts. So when we define water as H2O. Those are the parts of that, okay? It is a breaking down of the elements, okay? So we can't define simple objects. Let me give you an example of a simple thing. Here is the colour yellow. Quite a, let me put that in a better, there we go. There's the colour yellow. Define it, please. Oh, you can't. That's correct. Why can't you define the colour yellow? Wow, I don't know what I'm drawing here. Just some sort of box. Why can't you define the colour yellow? Well, you can't define it because it is simple. If you don't know what the colour yellow is, and to be honest, I'm colourblind, so I'm not entirely sure this is yellow. Please tell me if it's not. You can't define it because it is simple. So we've understood now what an open question is and what a closed question is. Something is not a successful definition if you can ask, well, is it always the case, or whatever like that, if you've understood the terms. Okay, it's a non-successful definition. It's a successful definition if we answer it by defining its complex parts into simple parts. Then we've done our job. That's a definition. So when we define good as naturalists do, is it an open question or a closed question? Well, Moore says that good is a simple concept, just like colour. It can't be defined. You can always ask further questions. Oh, wow, I can't spell ask, apparently. You can always ask questions. In other words, the questions are open. So you can't, he says, and I'm going to put this in red because really this is a criticism of naturalism. You can't define good. Let me give you an example here, right? So Mill, as a naturalist, says, well, good is pleasure, just like the sky is blue or water is H2O. But Moore would say, well, is it always pleasure? Is pleasure always good? There are examples like a torturer, if they're evil, derives pleasure from torturing someone. Is that good? That's a reasonable question to ask, is his point. And if it's a reasonable question to ask, given that we know what good is and we know what pleasure is, then you haven't defined good. And he gives this a term, the term of our tutorial today, the naturalistic fallacy. The naturalistic fallacy is committed, so it's when you define good. Okay, because you simply cannot define good. And the criticism of naturalism here is this. Well, they try to define good. Naturalists define good and therefore commit the naturalistic fallacy. So an example of that is, so Mill, for instance, says that good is defined as pleasure. But we've still got the open question here. The open question being, is pleasure always good? Now, if we can ask that, then Mill has not defined good. And Moore says, because good is this simple quality, it is beyond definition. Mill defines it like this, just as we can ask, is pleasure always good? It's the same way as we can ask, well, is the sky always blue? It's not a definition. Moore says you cannot define good. So any attempt, like a naturalist makes, to define good will fail. So he thinks naturalism is false.